Hello, my name is Mark Ellis from Stick and Rudder Studios, and today I want to take you through tutorial number 3 of Rex Camera 2.4. And what we're going to do is cover transitions and orbits and flybys, which actually take pretty big advantage of transitions. So without further ado, let's hop into X-Plane and take a look at how these features work. Okay, here we are in X-Plane. And I've got a demonstration camera file all set up here. So we have our cockpit cameras, and I've made an external category with just 3 cameras in it. And you know what? While I'm waiting here, why don't I make the light a little bit brighter here for this plane? Make it more daytime. There we go. So when we originally set up our cockpit cameras back in tutorial number 1. You'll recall that we used this enable smooth transition, and this is the thing that gave us the nice transition between the various cameras. See how it smoothly transitions as we move between these? But X camera actually has other transition types, particularly the linear transition and the Bezier curve transition, that can be used to have a lot more control over how the transition looks and how it works, and even gives you the ability to change transitions together between cameras so that you can make sequences out of them. And this is advantageous to either do some dramatic camera sequences for maybe YouTube videos that you're doing. The other place it's very good to be used is, say as an example, you might want to create a pre-flight inspection camera sequence where the camera literally moves around between the various inspection points on the plane, and you can even get it so that the camera will delay at that inspection point for some number of seconds before it moves on to the next one. So we're going to show you how to do all of that using these linear and Bezier curve transitions and the various options that go along with them. Okay. So let's take a look at these external cameras right now. So I have a tail camera. In fact, if I just close this, I have a tail camera. I got a camera on the right wing, and I have a camera on the nose. And you'll notice that I have no transition set up with these. As soon as I select the camera, it immediately snaps, to that view. Okay, so let's take a look at one type of transition that we can do. Now, we know we could do the smooth one, but let's come on down here and let's pick a linear transition. And transitions, by the way, are always oriented from the front camera to the camera you're going to. So if I want to transition to my right wing camera, this is where we define the transition. We go to the right wing camera, and then we're going to set up the transition we want. So regardless of where the camera is, if I select the right wing camera, what kind of a transition do I want going from wherever I was to this camera? So in this case, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say I want a linear transition. Now, linear transition is simply a straight line math problem. Wherever the camera was to wherever it's going to, I'm going to take a look at the X, Y, and Z coordinates, the differences between those. I'm going to look at the difference between the pitch and the yaw and the roll of the camera. And then I'm going to simply divide it by the number of transition frames that I want. Or if I'm going to do it in time-based, where what X camera will do is it'll take your average frame rate. If you say I want to do this over 5 seconds, it'll figure out how many frames do I need to do that with, and it'll do that math for you. And then it simply divides the transition up into, if I have 100 frames, then basically every position is going to be 1/100th of the difference between the origin and the destination camera. So let's take an example of what this would look like. Why don't we come in here, let's initially set this to say, I'm going to set it to 300 frames, which at my current frame rate here would probably be about 3 seconds. Actually a little more than that. Let's see what that looks like. So if I come to the tail, and I select the right wing, which is where the transition is defined on, I should get a nice transition over there. And again, because I use frames, it's going to calculate, it's going to basically do it over that number of frames, and how fast it goes is going to be entirely dependent on how fast my frame rate is. A better way to do this, frankly, is to do it with time-based, because then what's going to happen is Xcamera will actually calculate it for you. It'll say, at the time you execute the transition, what's your current frame rate? You want to do it over, let's say, 10 seconds. I now can calculate how many frames I need to do that transition in to get it so that it'll transition over 10 seconds. So why don't we come in here, let's just double click this. We're going to set this to 5. Go to the tail. And that should have happened roughly over 5 seconds. Now again, transitions are defined on the to camera, the camera you're going to. So this transition would work if I were to go to the nose and I hit right wing. It's going to go back the other way. Okay? So that kind of gives you, I think, a sense of how that works. And I can actually do this on all of them. Say, for instance, I want these transitions to occur on all the cameras. Well, let's do the same thing. Let's go to here. Let's set this guy to linear transition. We'll set him to 5 seconds. And we'll go to the nose. We'll set him to a linear transition. And we'll set him to 5 seconds. All right, let's take a look at how this looks. So no matter where I am, it's going to do this transition. Okay, so you're probably asking yourself, when I go from the tail to the nose, why is the camera aiming in the wrong direction? Well, part of it is because it is making an arbitrary calculation. We basically have the heading on this camera. In this case, the heading is 180. On the tail, it's 0. So what's interesting is I have to go 180 degrees, and what's happening is Xcamera is arbitrarily saying, well, am I going to go backwards or forwards, you know, in those degrees. So in that case, if I don't want it to do that, if I want the camera to always look at the plane, regardless of where it's positioned at and what the transition's doing, there's actually an ability to do that. And we talked about this back when we were doing external cameras in one of the tutorials. And that is this enable track camera pitch, enable track camera heading. So if I put that on all of these cameras, regardless of where the camera is, it will always point itself at the plane, regardless of what the transition is trying to calculate. So let's take a look at that. See how it did that? It's always pointing at the plane. No matter where the camera gets positioned in the transition. So that's a useful feature to use depending upon what you're trying to do. Okay, so let's assume for a moment that what we'd like to do is chain these guys together. So there is a capability called Auto Advance to the next camera. I actually had it on here so that it was actually doing this. But let's say, for instance, I go to the tail view. Maybe what I really should do is shut this off so that you can see what this looks like with it off. I don't know how. I must have turned this on at one point before and it got stuck on. So without auto advance to the next camera, it should just go to the one I'm going to. And then stop. Now let's say as an example, when I hit the right wing, I not only want it to go to the right wing, but I don't want it to stop there. I want it to keep going around and go to the nose. okay? And I want it to do it where I want the camera to kind of come around the tail all the way out to the right wing and then come back around to the nose. So the way we can do that is by using an auto advance to the next camera. And the way this works is, if I select the tail camera, if I enable auto advance to the next camera, what it will do is immediately, if the next camera's got a transition on it, it will immediately start to transition to that camera. So if I turn this on, and then I were to also come in here on the right wing and turn it on, what's going to happen is I hit the tail, it's going to immediately start transitioning to the right wing. As soon as it gets to the right wing, it's going to say, oh, this enable auto advance to next camera's turned on. It's immediately going to transition to the nose camera. And because I did not have that on in the nose camera, it should stop there. Now if I turn that on, frankly what it'll do is it'll keep going and going and going. I mean, at some point it's going to stop because there's a limit to how many times we let you do this, okay? But you could make it somewhat continuous. Generally the idea is the last camera in the sequence should not have this enable auto advance to the next, camera turned on. All right, so let's take a look at how that looks. You should start and then keep on going, and then it should stop at the nose, and it did. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this so that when I hit this tail camera, I don't want it to transition like this. All I have to do is on the tail camera just shut the transition off. Now, one more thing. When the control panel is up, if you've got auto advance to the next camera, by default it will not do that if the control panel is open. And the reason being is let's say I have a sequence and now I want to make some edits to it. If as soon as you hit the camera the thing starts going through the sequence, it's hard to get in there and like stop on the camera that you want to make the change to. So we have a bit of a fail-safe in here that unless you turn on this auto advance in the control panel, it will not auto advance by default. If you notice when I go to the right wing, it's going to stop here because I might want to make a change. Same with the nose. Notice with tail, it did, even though I've got enable auto advance to next camera on here, because I don't have it turned on here in the control panel, it's not going to do it. As soon as I do that, so that's just a gotcha to kind of remember here that, if you're trying to try out your transitions in the control panel, you have to check this to be able to see it, and then if you're trying to make adjustments and edits to it, shut it off so it doesn't drive you nuts, with it trying to advance when you're trying to make changes, to the camera. Okay, so let's say as an example, I would like this thing to do this transition the way I've got it set up. Let's actually look at it again. Let's turn this on. But now what I want is when I get to the wing view, I want to stay there for 5 seconds before I move on to the next one. So there is a transition delay right here that I can set up, and the transition delay is always set up on the 2 camera. So as I transition from the tail to the right wing and then to the nose, what I want is I want the delay on the nose. So I get to the tail, I get to the right wing, it immediately says, oh, I've got enable auto advance on the right wing. By default, it's just going to want to take off. But if I would like it to stay there for 5 seconds, what I do is on the nose, I'm going to set a delay to 5 seconds, which means anytime I select the nose camera, regardless of where I am, and the nose camera has a transition associated with it, the transition will not start until this timer, times down. So on the nose, let's set this to 5 seconds. When I hit the right wing, it should delay for 5 seconds, and you can actually see the little delay timer countdown here, and then it should go. And then it stops because the tail camera, which is basically the next one in the sequence, if I wrap back around again, it does not have a transition associated with it. Okay, now in that, but I don't have enable auto advance to the next camera. So I think you can get a sense of how you could use this to chain a whole bunch of cameras together to basically make a walk around set, right? You initially put the camera back, on the tail. You're, looking at the elevators. Put a delay on the next camera, before it moves, and you could sort of start this whole thing off, and it'll literally do a complete, kind of pre-flight inspection, type of a thing. Okay, so what's the difference between linear transitions and Bezier curve transitions? Well, let's actually take a look at this. Let me close this. Actually, maybe better off if I take that delay off of here, because you'll be able to see the join a little bit better. Okay, so you'll notice when it hit that right wing and it made the corner, it's not a very smooth curve. And the reason for that is that the wings are actually not perfectly in the center of the transition. They're actually farther, the wings are farther forward on the fuselage. So when X camera tries to do the calculation to figure out, what do I need for camera angles between the wingtip to the nose, it's got a different set of angles, okay, or degrees that it's going to transition than what I had from the tail, to the wingtip. It's also going to matter, what the difference is between the how far apart the cameras are between the tail and the nose. So it doesn't necessarily give you a nice smooth, thing all the way around. So what we could do if we use a Bezier curve, it's going to mathematically calculate how do I create a nice curve between the starting camera, the wing camera, which is a Bezier curve control point, and the nose camera, which is the second Bezier curve control point. So you could look up Google Bezier curves and see how they mathematically work, but they do give you a really nice smoothing effect. So why don't we go ahead and try that and see what that looks like. So all I'm going to do is change this guy on the right wing from a linear to a Bezier, and the nose I'm going to change from a linear to a Bezier. And let's see how this looks. And one of the things you may need to do is see how that gave you a really nice, smooth transition. So let's take a look at this Bezier curve transition again. Notice that compared to the linear transition, when the camera gets to the right wing, it's much closer in. And you might ask yourself, well, why is that? Well, the way the Bezier curve math works, the actual positions of the cameras get varied a little bit based upon particularly the control points, the ones in between the beginning and the end, which would be effectively that right wing. Its ultimate position for where the camera is going to be placed is based upon where all the other control points are, because it may need to move it in or adjust it a little bit to get it to be a nice smooth transition. So sometimes if you don't want it to be that close with a Bezier curve, you might actually need to move the camera out a little bit. So why don't we actually go ahead and do that. We'll go to this right wing. Notice what I had to do is I had to shut off that allow camera auto advance because it just kept on cycling around on me, and I wanted to stop on here and move it out. So I'm going to move this camera out a bit this way. Maybe I'll even move it up a little bit. Turn that back on again. Let's take a look at how this looks this time. So I think you get a sense of how, Bezier curves work. They can give you some really super smooth transitions between a number of cameras. Okay, so what I want to talk about next is the concept of hidden cameras. And I'm going to add one more camera here to this whole thing here. Let's again shut that off. I'm on the nose, and shut those off because sometimes that can be a bit of a pain. I'm going to put one more camera. Right over here on the left wing. Go back it out a little bit. Maybe bring it up a notch. We'll make it a Bezier curve.
Added camera 4 to category external.
I'm going to enable auto advance from the nose camera to the left wing. Don't have that off. Got Bezier curve on. 5-second transition delay. Let's just test this real quick and see how this works. Turn that on. Probably need to move the nose back out a little bit. I think we'll go ahead and do that. Shut that off, go to the nose. All right, so that's looking pretty nice. Now, if you'll notice down here, I'm seeing all of these cameras in the sequence, the tail, the right wing, the nose, the left wing. So I can come in here and I could select these. And of course, this is where it's going to get a little weird. I have auto advance on, it's going to come here, then it's going to try to go to another camera. You probably would never really try to get in the middle of this sequence like this. See what it's doing? Typically what I want is I only want to be able to pick the tail camera, have it go through its sequence, and then stop at the left wing once it's gotten there. And I don't want all of these other ones showing up in the mini control panel because frankly what they can do is they can kind of confuse things. When I see them here, I think I can click on them, and you can, but it doesn't behave right because it's not the way you designed this set of transitions. These are cameras that are sequenced, and it's expected that the tail is always going to be the starting point. So there's a way I can hide these so they show up in the control panel, but they will not show up in the mini control panel. So again, shut this off so it doesn't start taking off on me. And what I want to do is I want that one to be visible, but in the right wing, let me just find it here. There's should be a hidden camera. There it is. I'm going to hide these other cameras. Now keep in mind, I have to have at least one camera visible in the category. And I've got that. I got the tail, looks good. Right wing's hidden. Nose is hidden. Left wing is hidden. Let's shut that off. And now when I come down here, I only see the tail. And there's no ability for me to come in and start clicking around here and picking other cameras in the middle of the sequence, which frankly would mess me up. Right? But if we come in the control panel, they're still all there. It's just that, you know, these other ones are hidden. So the hidden camera's a pretty useful thing, and you'll actually see that used in things like orbits and flybys when we get to them, where, you know, when you're not expecting, okay, all these intermediate cameras to really be something that you can select, you can hide them so that they don't show up. Okay, so I think we've covered pretty much everything on transition. So you know the difference between linear transitions, which are going to give you a very straightforward from this camera to that camera, simple mathematics, you know, to divide up, you know, XYZ positions and yaw, pitch, heading, you know, based upon how many frames we're going to do that over, and you know, the position from and the two camera. Bezier curves are going to give you something a lot more smooth, particularly at the camera joint points, but you'll have to fuss around with moving the cameras around to get exactly the effect that you want with them. And we talked about the transition delay, where if on a two camera, if you want the transition to delay for some number of seconds before it starts, you can set that. And remember, that is on the camera that is the, you know, the two camera transition. And I think we also went over the enable track camera pitch and track camera heading. And again, these just help you a little bit in making sure the camera is always pointed to the center of the plane. And you know, we can quickly come in here and kind of turn these off if we want, just to kind of get a sense of what does it look like if I shut these all off. And it's already off on that one, so off. Let's just see what that looks like. Turn that on. So it didn't look too different, but one thing that's interesting is the pitch of the camera. I never adjusted the pitch on any of those cameras. And when it went up high, you'll notice that it wasn't really looking down. It doesn't really look down at the plane. Where in the other case where I had track camera pitch and track camera heading on, the camera always aims at where the center of gravity of the plane is. So those are good options. The only challenge with the track camera heading and track camera pitch is it makes it a little more difficult to sometimes move and position the cameras around, because as soon as you change the angle of the camera, a forward movement or a left-right movement is relative to where that camera is headed at. And you know, as you move it, it's constantly updating the heading and the pitch of the camera based upon where the aircraft is that you're pointing at. Okay, why don't we talk about orbits and flybys, which are, for all intent purposes, they're just ways of generating these predefined sequences of cameras that will give you an orbit and a flyby. So what I'm going to do is give me a minute to get this plane up in the air. I think that sometimes these are just look a little bit better when the plane's actually up and flying. So give me 1 minute and we'll come right back and take a look at how we create orbits and flybys. Okay, so here we are at 4,000 feet over my beautiful home state of New Hampshire, and let's create some orbits and flybys. Okay. Let me put this to solid so you can see it a little bit better. Okay, so orbits and flybys, all they really are is for each orbit and each flyby you define, Xcamera's got an ability to create a category, and the category name is going to be whatever you named your orbit and flyby, and we'll see that in just a minute. And then what it does is, based upon a set of parameters you give it, it just creates a series of cameras within that category that are going to create the orbit or the flyby effect, okay, that you want to see. So let's try an orbit first. You come up here to the category menu and just say create orbit. And you're going to get a dialog here where you can put in what you want the name of, what do you want the initial camera heading to be, what's the radius of the orbit, what's the minimum height in meters that we want, and what's the maximum height in meters, so the camera can like start off below the plane, then halfway through the orbit it'll go above the plane and then come back down again. How long do you want the duration to last? 30 seconds, 60 seconds, whatever. Do you want it to rotate to the orbit to the left or to the right? And do I want it to keep on going around and around and around and around until I stop it? So what I'm going to just change this, I'll call this orbit 1. And again, what's going to happen is it's going to create a category with that name. I like 270, that's perfectly fine. So it's going to be, I think, it's going to start off looking over the right wing. I'm going to make this radius, let's make this 25 meters out. And I think I'll make this go a little bit lower. Let's say minus 10 meters. We'll make this plus 10 meters. And that looks good. And we'll keep it like this. And we just say create. Now what you're going to see is it went ahead and it created that orbit. And let me make this translucent if we just do this. Okay, so I think you get a sense of what that works. So suppose what happens is, you know what, I don't like that. I want it in a little closer and I want it to go faster. All you do is create it again. Just come up, say create orbit. It keeps track of what your last name is. So if you don't change the name, it's just going to overwrite all the cameras that were defined in the last time. It's just going to overwrite everybody in that category and it's going to change it. So let's say this time I want it in a little closer. Maybe I'll keep it at 10. And I want it to go faster, and maybe like 15 seconds. All right, now let's take a look at what it did. If we come in here, and I'm going to shut this off so we can sequence through these cameras, you're going to see that it created each camera. You see all it did is it's got enable auto advance on, it's got track camera pitch and heading on, so it's always looking at it. That's all it did is it just created a whole bunch of cameras in here. Right? And the other thing I think you're going to notice is it hid everybody except the first one. So if I come down here, I'm just going to see orbit 1, that's the only camera in here, okay? And I have to probably, I'll just close this, okay, which will do it, cause it to start up, right? So if I come down here, orbit 1, and I can get it to start. Another common thing is typically people like to assign a hotkey to that. So what you might do is come in here. Oh, let's shut that off. See, this is the problem I was trying to tell you about this allow camera auto advance. If it's on, it just starts taking off, and it's a pain to be able to adjust things. So always disable that when you're trying to make edits. So in this camera, I'm going to go ahead and assign a view ID to it. And I'll pick a view ID at, let's say, 10. Okay? And now what should happen is the orbit's going to show up as a favorite. So I could be on the pilot view. I want to come in here, I want to run my orbit, bang, Okay, so now let's take a look at how we create flybys, which are a very similar process to the way we create orbits. And again, you just come up to the category category menu, you hit create flyby, and you'll be presented with a similar dialog. So here I'm going to call this flyby 1. I get to set the camera attack heading, which is which way is the camera facing relative to the aircraft when it starts. So in this case, it's going to be in front of the plane, aiming, not right at the tail, but kind of off to the right-hand side of the tail. We specify what the initial height in meters of the camera is relative to the plane. What's the total distance that we're going to traverse the camera over. Here it's 250 meters. This at the closest point of approach, how far away from the plane horizontally we're going to end up being. So here we're about 10 meters out. The closest point of approach on the z-axis, which is the front to back. Here I'm going to be a little bit behind, a little bit past the center of gravity of the plane when I hit that that closest point of approach. And then where do you want the camera to be up and down at the closest point of approach? Here I'm going to be a little bit below. And then what do you want the total duration to be? And I'm going to make this a little bit longer. Let's make this say 20 seconds. And you just go ahead and you create the flyby. Okay, so maybe we'd like to make a couple of changes to this. How about if we make it go faster or last quicker? All we have to do is the same thing. We're just going to go up and create it again. We use the same name. This time I'm going to change it to, let's say, 10 seconds. Get started again. Let's say we wanted to go, rather than going from the left-hand side of or the right-hand side of the plane to the left, let's switch it around. All we have to do is change the initial heading. Let's change it to say, let's say we're going to change it to maybe 150. Look at that again. Okay, so I think you get a sense of how you can set up all these different orbits and flybys. And if you want extra ones, just come up and give it a new name. You get a new category for every one. And similar to what we did with the orbit, if I want to give this a quick look view, again, shut off this auto advance because it can get a little aggravating sometimes to deal with it. We're going to go to this first camera and we're going to simply give it a view ID. Give it 23. Turn that back on again, close that. And if all's working right, if I go to the pilot view, I should see my flyby over here. And real quick at the flybys, it's really just two cameras. It's a linear transition between these two guys is all we're really doing. You know, with the total duration of whatever we set it up to be. So all X camera's doing is simply calculating, you know, given the starting heading, what do you want the closest point of approach to be, X, Y, Z. It just does the math, okay, to figure out what is the beginning and ending camera point. And it's a simple linear transition between those two. And you know, again, we hide the last camera because you know, you're never going to start it from there. You're always going to start it at the first camera. So I think that covers transitions in all the variations, and it also covers, you know, your orbits and your flybys, which are nothing more than automatically generated transitions, you know, into specified categories. And I would say the best way to get good at this is you just need to practice playing with it a little bit. You know, get the plane up in the air or do it on the ground and try some of these various transitions. Just a couple things to keep in mind. Remember whether or not you want to have an able track camera pitch you're heading on, which will always force the camera to be aimed at the center of gravity of the plane. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. And also don't forget, with the control panel open, you need to make sure you've got this thing checked if you want to actually see the transitions work. If you don't have this checked, then it's just not going to, none of the auto advanced stuff is going to work, because that allows you to kind of sequence through each camera and make the adjustments you want to it without it constantly taking off on you. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.